Hello everyone. There are many ways to discover the past, and not just in books, but history is also written in mannerisms, culture, and hairstyles. And we will be looking at hairstyles as a link to our past origins. Notice in ancient Egypt and in ancient Japan, there is an emphasis on the shaving of the front portion of the head, as in China during the Qing dynasty, the front portion of the head was shaved and a braid was grown long down the back. This can also be seen reflected in the hairstyles of the old Osage Nation, when the front portion of the head would be shaved and the back portion sometimes grown long, sometimes kept short. Now with animals, we also find a connection to the past, and we will start this portion off by talking about horses. Europe and European horses, and what is lacking with European horses when compared to the United States, which boasts wild horses, something you will not find in the United States. You can also find spotted horses in the Americas, when compared to the Americas, where you will find wild horses, something which you will not find in Europe or most parts of the world. Of course, in the Americas, you also find spotted horses, and you also find painted horses. While in the Bayeux tapestry, there are no depictions of these types of horses, causing a major problem with the narrative of horses not being native to America. Now, with dogs, we find a similar connection to the past, which contradicts the current propaganda of today in Europe. And this can be seen starting off with the Peruvian Inca orchid, which bears a resemblance and history to the Xoloitzcuintli breed of Mexico, as these dogs were known to travel in large groups with humans. And then the Xoloitzcuintli forms the basis for the Aztec deity Xolotl, who was keeper of the afterlife and is also depicted in a clear dog form. And this, of course, is from Mexico, but when we look at ancient Egypt, there is an obvious resemblance to the god Anubis, who bears the same essential responsibilities as Xolotl, watching over the passage to the afterlife. Of course, the propaganda would say that the jackal forms the basis for Anubis. Of course, maybe they built the pyramids also. Or perhaps it's, as they say, the Egyptian golden wolf that is Anubis, and perhaps they built the pyramids also. Or maybe it was the hyena. Next, they will be saying, this is the model for Anubis. And of course, the hyena also would have built the pyramids as well. Now, when we look at archaeology, we will start with Egypt, but move to other parts of the world, where we look at certain structures in Egypt that do not coordinate with what we are taught about Egyptian architecture, clearly belonging to a different culture, possibly older, but either way, what they say about it is not true. And in many of these structures, we find a stepping stone pattern, which is reflected in numerous buildings. And of course, there's also the well-founded theories of different structures in Egypt belonging to different cultures from different time periods being restored and built upon one another. Now, if we go to New Mexico and look at the ruins of Chaco, we find similar stepping stone patterns, as well as construction materials and the use of stacked rocks, and also similar design in their build. And then when we go to Mexico, we find a treasure trove of this same sort of building style, with the stepping stone pattern and also the stacking of rocks to form natural structures. And we also find a cylindrical pattern, which we find in Chaco and Egypt. And then when we go to Peru and we look at Machu Picchu, we also find similar stepping stone structures. And the stacked rock, just as in Ecuador at Pumapungo, where we find the same pattern of construction design and the stepping stone, of course. And then when we look at Nanmadol in the South Pacific, we find the same idea of stacking stones and also the stepping stone. Of course, they also lie to us and say that Petra was built by the Nabateans, which are a nomadic group, and categorically, nomadic groups were not known for building immense structures that that are much more logically attributed to sedentary cultures. Now, when we go to the Osage Indian Customs and Myths by Lewis F. Burns, we find other explanations for our origins. And then when we look at the hidden history of the human race, Forbidden Archaeology by Michael A. Cremo and Richard L. Thompson, we get another look at this subject. Starting out, quote, at a place called Pikermi, near the plains of Marathon, in Greece, there is a fossil-rich stratum of late Miocene Tortonian age, explored and described by the prominent French scientist Albert Gaudry during the meeting in 1872 at Brussels of the International Congress of Prehistoric Anthropology and Archaeology. Baron von Duker reported that broken bones from Pikermi proved the existence of humans in the Miocene. Von Duker, 1873, Part 104 through 107, page. Modern authorities still place the Pikermi site in the late Miocene. Nilsson, 1983, page 476. Jakob Hagen, 1986, pages 213 through 221. Von Duker first examined numerous bones from the Pikermi site in the Museum of Athens. He found 34 jaw parts of Hipparion, an extinct three-toed horse, and antelope, as well as 19 fragments of tibia and 22 other fragments of bones from large mammals, such as rhinoceros. All showed traces of methodical fracturing for the purpose of extracting marrow, according to von Duker, 1873, pages 104. They all bore more or less distinct traces of blows from hard objects. He also noticed many hundreds of bone flakes broken in the same manner. It would thus appear that these fractured bones would satisfy the requirements of 19th century authorities such as Steenstrup, as well as modern authorities, in addition, such as Binford with regard to impact notches as a sign of intentional breakage. In addition, von Duker observed many dozens of crania of Hipparion and antelope showing methodical removal of the upper jaw in order to extract the brain. The edges of the fractures were very sharp, which may generally be taken as a sign of human breakage, rather than breakage by non-carnivores or geological pressures. One might question whether the bones in the museum collection actually belonged to the Miocene stratum of Pikermi, but many of them had a matrix of red clay clearly confirming the layer from which they were recovered. The museum personnel said, however, that no stone tools or traces of fire had been found with the bones. Von Duker then journeyed to the Pikermi site himself to continue his investigation. During the course of his first excavation, he found dozens of bone fragments of Hipparion and antelope and reported that about 1/4 of them bore signs of intentional breakage. In this regard, one might keep in mind Binford's finding that in assemblages of bones broken in the course of human marrow extraction, about 14 through 17% have signs of impact notches. I also found, stated von Duker, 1873, pages 105, among the bones a stone of a size, end quote. Now in the next part, quote, Garrigo also displayed a radius, one of the bones of the lower forelimb, presenting a longitudinal fracture terminating at a right angle to the end of the bone. The fracture had the same patina as the rest of the bone, indicating the break was made when the bone was fresh, and the broken part had a surface so clean and sharp that it was impossible to see it as a natural geological. Subterranean pressure and shifting, if it had occurred, would have almost certainly damaged the perfectly intact edges and joint surfaces of the fractured long bone. In making these observations, Garrigo showed a good grasp of taphonomic principles. He also pointed out that the longitudinal fracture on the specimen he showed was identical to those encountered on hundreds of similar bones at Sansan. Here we may note that longitudinal fracturing is characteristic of breaking bone for the purpose of obtaining marrow. Binford, 1981, page 162, stated marrow is primarily contained in the medullary cavity of the body or shaft of long bones. This shaft is shaped like a cylinder, so access to the medullary cavity and hence the marrow is facilitated by collapsing or fracturing the cylinder longitudinally. Transversal fractures in the center of long bone shafts do not provide ready access to the marrow. Garrigo also showed that many of the bone fragments had very fine and delicate striations such as found on broken bones of the late Pleistocene. The marks could be indications of processing the bone for marrow breaking, as described by Binford. The secret of controlled breakage of marrow bones is the removal of the periosteum, the sheath of connective tissue covering bone surfaces, in the area to be impacted. The Nunamute invariably do this by scraping it back with the edge of a knife, a rough surface on a hammerstone, or almost any handy crude scraping tool. This means that longitudinal scratches and striations along the shafts of long bones are commonly produced when bones are prepared for cracking during marrow processing. Such marks are noted in Mousterian Neanderthal assemblages, Binford, 1981, page 135. Garrigo also displayed two metacarpals, foot bones, each with the smaller end removed by a direct blow. He pointed out that since flint tools had been found in the Miocene, one should not be astonished to find the effects of their usage. Food is the primary human need, so one should expect to observe signs of human attempts to secure it. Garrigo, 1873, page 137. On a separate part, 2.7, Colline de Sanson, France, Middle Miocene. The report of the rhinoceros jaw of Billy led to the opening at the meeting of the French Academy of Sciences on April 20th, 1868, of a sealed packet deposited at the Academy on May 16th, 1864, by the researchers F. Garrigo and H. Filhol. These gentlemen wrote on that day, "We now have sufficient evidence to permit us to suppose that the contemporaneity of human beings and Miocene mammals is demonstrated." Garrigo and Filhol, 1868, page 819. This evidence was a collection of bones apparently intentionally broken from Sanson, France. Especially noteworthy were broken bones of the small deer, Dicroceras elegans. The bone beds of Sanson were judged to be of Middle Miocene age, the Miocene. One may consider a devastating effect that the presence of human beings about 15 million years ago would have on current evolutionary doctrines. Were the 19th century scientists correct in their determination of the age of the site? Once more, the answer to this question is yes. Modern authorities, Romer, 1966, page 334, still place Sanson in the Middle Miocene. The Dicroceras elegans is assigned to the Helvetian land mammal stage, which is considered Middle Miocene. Klein, 1973, page 566. Romer, 1966, page 334. According to De Mortele, Edouard Lartet, who also excavated fossils from Sanson and himself sent to Garrigo some of the bones on which Garrigo and Filhol founded their assertions, did not believe in human action on the bones. There were many broken bones at Sanson, and De Mortele, 1883, pages 64 through 65, in his usual fashion, said that some were broken at the time of fossilization, perhaps by desiccation, and others afterward by movement of the strata. Garrigo, however, maintained his conviction that the bones of Sanson had been broken by humans in the course of extracting marrow. He made his case in 1871 at the meeting in Bologna, Italy, of the International Congress of Prehistoric Anthropology and Archaeology. Garrigo, 1873, first presented to the Congress a series of recent bones with undisputed marks of butchering and breaking for comparison. He then presented bones of the small deer, Dicroceras elegans, collected from Sanson. And then in a different section, quote, Von Duker's second excavation was made in the presence of one of the founders of the International Congress of Prehistoric Anthropology and Archaeology, Professor G. Capellini of Bologna, Italy. Capellini, who believed that broken bones were by themselves insufficient to demonstrate the presence of human beings at a site, did not attach as much significance to the Picerni finds as did von Duker. Nevertheless, He thought the bones had been fractured before the time of deposit. Capellini reported that he had visited the museum and found the majority of bones were not broken by humans, as believed by von Ducker. Capellini pointed out that, in fact, there were many bones and skulls on display that remained whole and in good condition. Von Ducker replied that the fact that some bones were not broken did not change the fact that others were broken, and these in a way that suggested intentional work. He noted that Gaudry had naturally selected the best bones for his museum displays. Von Ducker, 1873, page 106. Von Ducker stated that Capellini's very brief examination could hardly compare with his own lengthy and careful study, lasting for a period of several months both in the museum and at the site. De Mortelet stated that Von Ducker's report was submitted to Gaudry, who found no evidence of human work. De Mortelet also examined the bones and agreed with Gaudry and Capellini and the breakage was accidental. It is, however, interesting to note that Von Ducker, after communicating his observations to Gaudry, received the following statement from Gaudry. I find every now and then breaks in bones that resemble those made by the hand of man, but it is difficult for me to admit this. Von Ducker, 1873, page 107. In Gaudry's remarks surfaces one of the central questions confronting us in our examination of the treatment of paleoanthropological evidence. The evidence appears in general to be quite ambiguous, so on what basis can one draw conclusions? Gaudry hinted that his preconceptions were in subtle conflict with his perceptions. Humans in the Miocene, it was difficult for him to admit. Preconception triumphed, however quietly, over perception. Now these of course are simply examples of blatant propagandizing and intentional dishonesty when it comes to archaeological finds. However, in the Osage Indian Customs and Myths by Lewis F. Burns, we find some other examples of where our origins came from in manners that are mostly suppressed today. Quote, the center or grip of the bow was often wrapped with wet rawhide strands which would shrink when dry and reinforce the bow. This shrinking was often so great as to leave indentations in the wood of the bow. Tendons were also used to wrap the center 1/3 of the bows. Bows used when afoot were usually longer than the English longbow. In some examples, we have seen they were well over 6 feet in length. These were almost universally made of Osage orange and were flat bows with no significant reinforcement in the midsection. Some of these foot bows had a series of small holes bored through the bow to the left and above the grip. Without a doubt, these were peep sights for various ranges. Then in a different section, we find an example of blatant propagandizing, where a clear revision was edited into the work. Quote, honeybees were not native to North America. When bees appeared, the Indians knew the American settlements would follow within 2 or 3 years. In a sense, the bee was the vanguard of the American frontier. Now that is obviously propaganda and false, but it presents a perfect explanation and example of what was taking place